This scene and this other scene have a lot in common. In both cases, we've got an alien conqueror coming to Earth to wipe out humanity for the sake of their own race. In both scenes, they're stopped by a hero with the same powers, who rejects their origins to protect humanity. And both fights end with the hero killing the villain in a super brutal way. But Conquest's death is one of the most unforgettable moments in Invincible, and a fan-favorite scene. Zod's death, on the other hand, is one of the most controversial scenes in the whole DCU. Zack Snyder even had to explain himself multiple times, just to get fans to stop saying he didn't understand Superman. But why did people react so differently to these two deaths? There are 3 reasons that explain it. And before you say it, I know Conquest is technically still alive, but no one except Cecil and Donald knows that. Plus, Mark wanted to kill him, and he thinks he did, which is what matters here.
Is that clear?
The first reason is how evil each character is. Even though superheroes usually have a no-killing rule, sometimes they go up against villains so insanely evil that just beating them up and locking them away doesn't feel like enough. That's what happens in The Killing Joke. After seeing what Joker does to Barbara Gordon, no one would blame Batman for taking him down for good, to make sure something like that never happens again. That's not the case when Oliver kills the Mauler twins though, because those two weren't sadistic. Sure, they killed a couple soldiers that day, but Oliver could have stopped them without killing them. Plus, in Season 2, Angstrom Levy showed they could have been reformed and used their brains to help humanity, something Joker would never do. The more evil a villain is, the more okay we are with the hero taking drastic measures against them. Conquest fits right in the Joker category. He's sadistic, super violent, and loves watching his victims suffer. He laughs while killing innocent civilians, licks Eve's blood after leaving her for dead, and tries to rip Oliver in half after already beating him. He's pure evil. He has no honor code and has no chance of redemption. We know that if Mark doesn't stop him, he'll destroy the entire world for fun. We've seen him do such awful stuff that we cheer when Invincible takes him down. It's not exactly a happy scene. The music's pretty dark to show Mark's moral shift, but we don't want him to stop hitting Conquest because he totally deserved the beating. Zod, on the other hand, isn't that awful. I know how that sounds, but hear me out. Let's go over all the villainy stuff he pulled in Man of Steel. He killed Jor-El in a fight to the death, threatened Clark's mom but didn't actually hurt her, activated the terraforming machine which killed a lot of people, and threatened to wipe out humanity in the final battle. And he threatened to kill this family too, but he didn't actually hurt them, because Superman decided to get his hands dirty. Zod is a bad guy, no doubt, but we mostly hear him talk about doing terrible things. We don't actually see him doing them the same way we do with Conquest. That just doesn't hit the same for us. Zod might have caused just as many deaths as in the Conquest fight, with all the buildings falling down, but he didn't personally kill people in Metropolis with his own hands. He also doesn't enjoy causing pain like Conquest does, because Zod's a strategist trying to protect his people. And like we've seen in the comics, he can be reasonable. If Superman hadn't destroyed the Kryptonian ships, and just let Krypton be rebuilt somewhere else, Zod wouldn't have needed to kill anyone. Just like the Mauler twins, Zod could have been redeemed, and maybe even helped humanity, or, well, Kryptonians. That's why we've seen him team up with Superman a few times in the comics, because they've got common goals. Now, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't want Zod as my best friend or anything, because he's still a villain, but he's nowhere near as evil as Conquest. You might even feel kinda bad that Superman killed Zod, since he didn't entirely deserve that fate.
I exist only to protect Krypton, and now I have no people.
I missed the part where that's my problem.
The second reason one death works while the other doesn't is the difference in power levels, especially compared to the hero. When Conquest shows up on Earth, he's not just the strongest villain Mark has faced. He's the most powerful character in the entire Invincible universe, at least so far. We all know Thrag is stronger, but he hadn't shown up in the show or the comics at that point. I also know Adam Eve's got the most potential, but she hadn't fully unlocked her powers yet. So yeah, Conquest is the strongest character we've seen yet. This is a big deal because Mark is always at a disadvantage during this fight. Conquest toys with him for half the fight and still tosses him around like a rag doll. Mark begs for mercy halfway through. His brother saves him once and Eve saves him twice from certain death. If she hadn't blasted Conquest with that deadly ray and burned half his body, Mark wouldn't have stood a chance. Even at the end, Conquest breaks Mark's hand with just one arm and barely any skin left.
Totally badass.
Mark couldn't beat Conquest in a fair fight, so he had to take the one shot he got to save the world. He took him down because he had no other choice. If Conquest had recovered, the world would have been doomed. Eve was already down, and most of Earth's heroes had been defeated during the Invincible War. Since it wasn't a fair fight, it's easier to accept that Mark broke his no-kill rule, because killing Conquest was the only way to win. And I know what you're thinking. Technically, Mark has a big advantage at the very end. Conquest is down, missing half his face, and struggling to breathe. He's not really a threat anymore, but Mark keeps punching him until his face turns to mush. But it all happened so fast that we can let it slide, especially since Mark wasn't sure if Conquest would get back up. He thought he killed Angstrom the same way, and that guy came back to wreck his life. I I can't really blame Mark for making sure his enemy stayed down this time. But Zod's case is totally different. His fight with Superman feels way more balanced. In fact, the Man of Steel actually has the upper hand in the final minutes. Since Superman's been exposed to yellow sunlight his whole life, he's stronger than Zod and knows how to use his powers better. Usually Zod evens the score with his military training. He's a way better fighter than Clark, but Superman is more powerful in every single version and adaptation. We see this very clearly in Man of Steel. By the time Zod arrives on Earth, Clark already knows how to use all his powers. Zod only gets sunlight for a few hours and figures out how to fly and use heat vision during the final battle. Without his military skills, Superman would have taken him down in 2 minutes. But even with those, Zod can't beat him. In this scene, Zod hurls a satellite at Superman and knocks him into orbit, but Clark turns it around and slams Zod into a building when they hit the ground. Then he pins Zod down, and the guy can't get back up because Clark's stronger. Zod just can't break the hold Superman's got on him. If it weren't for the fact that this poor family was conveniently standing nearby, Clark would have choked Zod until he lost consciousness, and the fight would have been over. In fact, Clark could have poked Zod's eyes so he couldn't use his heat vision, or he could have turned Zod's gaze away so the family could escape.
Why didn't I think of that?
Since Superman is stronger, he had options, unlike Mark. He was never in control against Conquest, and couldn't have pulled off a move like that. The key thing is, Superman chooses to kill Zod, because he says that he'll never stop. He'll always be a threat to humanity, so Superman decides to end it for good. But a lot of fans got mad about this because Clark could have done something else. He could have knocked him out, or tried to reopen the portal to the Phantom Zone. Being weaker than Conquest, Mark didn't have those options. Or at least he couldn't think of any of them by the end of the fight. And now we have the third reason, the hero's moral code. So far, we've talked about how the audience reacts to these two scenes. But we can't ignore that Invincible and Superman are completely different heroes, with different character arcs and a whole different outlook on life. In Season 1, Mark said he'd never kill anyone, just like Superman. In Season 2, he thought he'd killed Angstrom, but convinced himself it was an accident. And at the start of Season 3, he scolded his brother for taking down the Mauler twins without showing any mercy.
No mercy!
Mark said they shouldn't kill because all life is sacred, even their enemies. But during the Invincible War, Mark lets go of his moral code. After seeing all the death and chaos Angstrom caused, he decides to kill him, to prevent something like that from happening again. In the end, he doesn't do it because Levy managed to escape using his portals. But the key is, Mark wanted to kill him. And at the end of the season, he tells Oliver he was right all along. Like I said in my Conquest video, this villain forces Mark to change how he sees life and the rules he lives by. From this point on, he justifies killing bad guys if he thinks it's necessary. Later in the comics, he even says he doesn't see himself as a hero anymore. Mark taking down Conquest feels totally in character because it reflects who he's become. You might not totally agree with what he did, but he's consistent. He sticks to his own moral code. Plus, the show doesn't shy away from the fact that he just killed someone. Once he wakes up in the hospital, Mark wants to make sure Conquest is really dead, and that's not going to change the next time they meet. I won't spoil what happens in the comics, but let's just say they're not becoming besties, and Mark's definitely not apologizing for trying to take him down. This scene feels earned because Invincible's arc shows how he goes from a traditional hero to a more pragmatic one. But with Cavill's Superman, none of that happens. You've probably heard this a million times, but Superman doesn't kill. Or at least that's what DC editors have tried to make us believe since the 40s, when the no-kill rule was established. Superman did kill in his early appearances, but that was retconned decades later, and most adaptations stick to this rule. Ask any Superman fan, and they'll tell you he does not kill under any circumstance, because he always finds another way. That's why this scene is so controversial, because it feels out of character.
I'm not convinced.
To be fair, Cavill's Superman never actually says he has a no-kill rule. It's not something they spell out at any point, but it's such an important part of his character in every single version that everyone expects Superman not to kill, unless we're seeing an alternate universe, like Injustice. Snyder could reinvent the character however he wanted, but this part was so core that fans just couldn't accept it being changed, especially when it wasn't really justified, like we saw in the first two reasons. That's why comic book legend Mark Waid said he couldn't believe Superman killed Zod, and felt like he had to leave the theater at that very moment. He felt insulted, and said that this version of the Man of Steel wasn't his Superman. And I already know what you're gonna say, that all of this is bullshit, because Superman had already killed Zod twice before Man of Steel. First in Superman 2 and later in Superman issue 22 from 1988. But that's not entirely true. In Superman 2, Clark pushes Zod to the abyss in the Fortress of Solitude, and many assumed the general was dead. But in a deleted scene, we see that Zod and his minions were actually arrested by the police, so that doesn't count. What did happen is that Superman killed a Zod variant in the comics comics in one of the character's most controversial storylines. In The Price, written by the legendary John Byrne, Superman faces 3 Kryptonian criminals who had annihilated all life on an alternate Earth. The Man of Steel uses gold kryptonite to strip the trio of their powers, but the Kryptonians swear they'll eventually get to the main universe and repeat their massacre on Earth. Faced with no other option, Superman executes all 3 criminals using green kryptonite from that universe. He exposes them to the lethal radiation, watching as they collapse. Zod even begs for mercy in his final moments, but Kal-El is unmoved.
Way to go psycho there.
You could say this is even worse than what we got in Man of Steel, but the main difference is that in the comic, Superman actually faces consequences for his actions. He is overwhelmed with guilt and returns home a changed man. This launched the Exile arc, in which Superman banishes himself from Earth to wander in space. He's haunted by nightmares of what he's done, and ultimately, this storyline is used to reaffirm his no-kill code even more strongly. His development is the opposite of Invincible's. While Mark abandoned his code to save the world, Superman doubled down on his after killing. Something like that could have worked in the movies. Henry Cavill mentioned that one of the ideas for Man of Steel 2 was to explore the character's morality and how Zod's death had changed him. But since that movie was never released, the topic was left hanging. Superman doesn't face moral dilemmas or grow as a character in his later appearances. And to make matters worse, at the end of Man of Steel, we see him laughing with the military and flirting with Lois Lane. He doesn't seem all that remorseful about what he did. He's not forever traumatized by caressing Zod's neck. Beyond this scream, Zod's death doesn't really have any consequences. Conquest's death works because it's more consistent with the characters. This was only possible thanks to the creative control Robert Kirkman had over both the comic and the Prime Video adaptation. That's one of the key reasons why Invincible surpassed Marvel and DC. Don't believe me? We break it down in this video over here.
Have a great day, ladies.